Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in here as we get closer and closer to the end of our Intro to Creative Writing course, which I'm just going to click myself into. So we have finished up the Creative Nonfiction workshop, and I'd mentioned before that creative nonfiction is probably one of those genres with which people are least familiar. Even if you've never actually written a short story or poetry before, it's probably something that you've read, are familiar with in other ways, but creative nonfiction is just one of those, types of writing that, while it's actually much more prevalent than people realize, we don't necessarily identify it as that particular genre or necessarily write in it consciously or have much experience with it. So it's I think it's very accessible because generally you're writing about yourself and your own experiences. But it's actually, I think, a little bit tricky precisely because it seems so accessible and so personal. So one of the things that often happens, and we saw it, I think, with this unit, and again, this is very common, is that because it's such a personal kind of beginning or a core for the story that you want to tell, it's a personal experience, it already has meaning for you. But what you have to remember is that just because something was very meaningful for you in the context of your life, just saying that to a reader doesn't necessarily make the reader really believe or feel that sense of importance or the importance of the occasion or the event in the same way that you as the writer do. So that makes the genre particularly tricky because you have to be both the writer of the thing, but also the reader of the thing, having no knowledge, no particular connection to the characters involved, the event itself, or the memory or moment you're trying to evoke, and that kind of thing. So you really have to be conscious to make the moment more than just the moment. In other words, you can't just report on what happened. Even if you go to great lengths to describe lots of the detail, that evokes the scene, but it doesn't necessarily invoke the importance or evoke the importance of that particular moment for the reader. And that's where creative nonfiction really is both most difficult but also most profound as a genre, is that it takes what are often very singular kind of experiences that are meaningful for one person, or they're meaningful not in a big universal sense, but just in this very kind of everyday practical sense. But from that, it teases out the larger kind of metaphorical meaning. And again, if you're coming out the end of that workshop feeling like you had this great moment that you wanted to write about, and you feel like you really reported on that moment effectively, there's lots of detail, you expressed how excited you were or how important this moment was, I would really challenge you to maybe go back and do a little more reading within that unit. Some of the sample essays that we have access to in the works of the COD faculty, Tom Montgomery Fate, who is, I think, nationally known as a creative nonfiction writer. So he's like one of the best, not just locally for us, but really one of the best. You'll notice that consistently what he's able to do is take a moment from his life that can be very, again, unprofound in some ways, but without being heavy-handed about it, he's able to evoke the larger kind of emotional meaning from that. And again, he doesn't just tell you that it's important, he shows you that it's important. And so that's, again, where it becomes that old rule of creative writing generally, is to show something, don't tell it. Don't tell me you were excited, show me that you were excited by the way that you talk or behave. Don't tell me that a moment was really important because you'd waited all your life for it. You really have to show me. And again, once you've done that, you really need to show like the larger kind of symbolic or metaphoric significance of it. And this is precisely where you can see the difference between creative nonfiction that just tells that story, which can be very good, but then creative nonfiction. And so that's creative nonfiction as the easiest genre to write in because you just tell your story. Creative nonfiction as the hardest genre to write in is exactly that other piece of the puzzle where you need to do more than just tell the story. You need to kind of imply its significance, not just to you personally, but in some larger sense. Again, it's it's hard to explain because, like any kind of writing, you can talk about it on the level of theory or abstractness and lay out rules, and you should do this and you should not do that. But again, reading it as it actually exists in writing, like the examples we have, or any other kinds of examples you can run into, that's really where you see those ideas of writing in practice, and it's through that practice that you can begin to see what it looks like and then emulate it in your own writing. But anyway, so a tricky genre to write in, partly ironically because it seems like such an easy genre to write in, so it's very deceptive that way. Maybe the exact opposite then goes for poetry, which is the genre that we move into now. For many people, the idea of poetry has all of these connotations, many of them negative, that it's very formal, it has to follow traditional structures, it has to rhyme, it has to do this, it can't sound like that, all that kind of stuff. So it seems like a very intimidating kind of genre to write in. There's a lot of barriers to get through before you can just do it. The opposite for creative nonfiction, where it seems like, oh, I've done stuff, I can just write that. But actually, neither of those things is true, right? So with poetry, really what I want you to do is to kind of let go of all the baggage of what you think poetry has to be about, has to sound like in terms of word choice, has to be like in terms of structural devices or formal devices like rhyming, and all that sort of stuff. In fact, rhyme is probably the biggest pitfall that people fall into, is that they think poetry, what makes poetry poetry is that it's words on a page that rhyme. So they force themselves to rhyme, and they're making all kinds of weird word choices. They're building sentences backwards. They're saying things in ways that we would never say them or even write them otherwise, all for the sake of having it rhyme, which is all for the sake of making it poetry. So just kind of abandon all of that and try to approach poetry as you might have approached creative nonfiction, that it really is immediately accessible. You can write it because you can write it just like any other genre. What makes it poetry is, and that's really hard to define, and we won't go into that too much here, it'll take forever. But the thing that maybe separates poetry from other genres is not that it's inaccessible, but that there's a kind of intensity of language going on that you have to be very careful with. And in fact, I'm very biased towards poetry, as that's kind of my main genre when I do write. The bias will reveal itself right away in what I'm about to say, is that if you could kind of rank genres in terms of most important or whatever, which you can't, so don't do it, but that's what I'm going to do. For me, if there were like a genre to write in on the level of practice, so you might be a working novelist, or you might really focus on short fiction, but in terms of getting better as a writer, practicing the art of poetry makes you a better writer in all genres. It's sort of like the foundational genre for me. And it's precisely because of that intensity of language. So just because a poem exists in half a page, it doesn't necessarily do less than a 10 or a 20-page short story would do. It just has to do it. It has to be as meaningful, as evocative, as kind of intellectually stimulating, and all the stuff that a good short story would be. It has to do that, but with this real economy of language. So you can't just have extra stuff in there. It doesn't work. You can't have, 3 descriptions where really one, you have to pick that best one, where really one would do. You can't tell me a bunch of stuff. You have to show me a bunch of stuff. So it's almost like poetry really forces us to condense those rules into this very tight, fitting kind of space. And so, I guess another way of saying this is that if you're a good short story writer, you could probably write decent poetry, but I wouldn't take that as a given. If you're a good poet, I bet you could write well in all the other genres. It might take a little bit of practice or thinking about it, but you already have the skills in place to do it. I'm not sure you could flip that equation around and have it work exactly the same way. But really, for us, the thing to be thinking about is poetry is not laden with all this baggage that we usually think it comes laden with in terms of, again, topic, form, style, the sort of the atmosphere of it. Try to leave all of that at the door And in fact, you can read a lot of examples of contemporary poetry, not modern or postmodern poetry, which is its own specific style of writing, that can be very intimidating and it doesn't feel very accessible. But a lot of contemporary poetry is really moving away from that inaccessibility, kind of the T.S. Eliot model that we've looked at here in the course, and much more towards like a conversational style of poetry, like someone is literally just talking to you, which is both accessible, which is nice, but it often preserves that real economy of language, so a lot is happening in a fairly small space. Again, if you can get good at that, you can do other genres with ease. One of my favorite contemporary poets who's a great example of this is Billy Collins, who is a poet laureate and is famous in his own poetry writer sort of way. But some of his work comes off, I don't want to say stand-up comedy exactly, but it does sort of sound like an anecdote. Like, did you ever notice that kind of Seinfeld model, if you're familiar with that, of just everyday observation? What makes it more than just telling jokes, of course, is that in this everyday observation, he's able to extract or kind of bring forth, again, these larger meanings, sort of the lesson from creative nonfiction. So notice again that if you can do that in poetry, you could probably do it in creative nonfiction as well. Okay, so that's a few things to think about as we get into the poetry section of our course, and actually as we get towards the end of our course as well. So keep an eye on those due dates and the final kind of units that we have coming up here. Our poetry workshop, and then one last open genre workshop where you're free to write short story, creative nonfiction, poem, whatever suits your fancy. And then we're pretty much done. So we've made it pretty quickly through our course. So if you have any concerns or questions, be in touch with me. And otherwise, I'll talk to everybody soon.